The dust settled over Morrison Ranch like a burial shroud as Jacob Morrison stumbled through the barn door, his weathered hands trembling from exhaustion and hunger. It was the third day he'd gone without a proper meal, surviving only on creek water and the bitter taste of failure. The autumn sun beat down mercilessly on the Texas plains, indifferent to the collapse of yet another small rancher's dreams. Jacob was 42 years old, though the mirror suggested 60. His face was carved with deep lines from years of squinting against the unforgiving sun, and his once powerful frame had withered to sinew and bone. The ranch that had belonged to his grandfather, passed down with pride and promises, now stood on the precipice of foreclosure. 23 head of cattle had dwindled to 7. The north pasture lay fallow, choked with thistle and regret. But it wasn't always this way. 5 years earlier, Jacob Morrison had been a man of modest success. He'd married his sweetheart, Sarah, in a ceremony under the cottonwood trees by Miller's Creek. They dreamed together of expanding the ranch, maybe buying the adjacent property, raising children who would carry on the Morrison legacy. Life had seemed full of possibility, stretched out before them like the endless prairie sky. Then came the drought of 2019. It lasted 3 brutal years, turning the grasslands to dust and the creeks to cracked earth. Hay prices skyrocketed. Feed became scarce. One by one, Jacob had to sell his cattle just to afford feed for the remaining herd. Then Sarah got sick, a mysterious illness that the county doctors couldn't properly diagnose without expensive tests they couldn't afford. The medical bills piled up like tumbleweeds against a fence. Sarah fought for 18 months before she passed away on a cold January morning, leaving Jacob alone with memories and debts that would take 3 lifetimes to repay. The life insurance policy he thought they had lapsed 6 months before her death when he'd chosen to pay the feed supplier instead. Now, on this scorching afternoon in late September, Jacob Morrison was a hollow man shuffling through a hollow ranch, barely alive himself. He hadn't eaten in 72 hours. Pride had kept him from asking neighbors for help. The same pride his grandfather had instilled in him with lectures about Morrison men standing on their own 2 feet. But pride doesn't fill an empty stomach, and Jacob had finally reached his breaking point. His vision blurred as he moved through the barn. The 7 remaining cattle, his last hope, watched him with those large, patient eyes that seemed to understand more than animals should. His best cow, Bessie, a gentle Hereford who'd been Sarah's favorite, lowed softly as he passed. He couldn't even look at her without feeling shame. The plan had formed slowly over the past week, creeping into his thoughts during the sleepless nights. The Hendersons' ranch, 5 miles north, was the largest in the county. They were good people, wealthy but not unkind. He'd heard through the grapevine that they were looking for temporary ranch hands for the fall roundup. It wasn't much, but if he could work for even a week, he might earn enough for food and buy himself time to figure out his next move. Jacob saddled up Thunder, his aging quarter horse, one of the few possessions he hadn't been forced to sell. The horse was 20 years old, gray around the muzzle, but still reliable. As he mounted, a wave of dizziness crashed over him. He gripped the saddle horn, waiting for the world to stop spinning. "Come on, old friend," he whispered to Thunder. "One more ride. We can do this." The journey to Henderson Ranch should have taken an hour and a half at a steady pace. But Jacob's weakened state meant frequent stops. The September heat was oppressive, and he'd forgotten to bring water. Every mile felt like 10. His thoughts began to wander, memories mixing with hallucinations. He saw Sarah standing in the golden grass, wearing her wedding dress, smiling that smile that had once made everything worthwhile. He blinked, and she vanished like morning mist. He heard his grandfather's voice, rough and commanding. "A Morrison never begs, boy. We work for what we need." "I'm trying, Grandpa," Jacob mumbled to the empty air. "I'm trying." By the time the Henderson Ranch came into view, a sprawling operation with white fences, multiple barns, and a main house that looked more like a mansion, Jacob could barely stay upright in the saddle. His vision tunneled. The edges of the world went dark and fuzzy. He guided Thunder up the long driveway, past the manicured gardens and the working corrals where healthy cattle grazed on green pastures. The contrast to his own dying ranch was almost too painful to bear. This is what Morrison Ranch could have been, should have been, if only. The main house loomed before him, 2 stories of white-painted wood with a wraparound porch and rocking chairs that spoke of comfortable evenings and full bellies. Jacob dismounted, or rather, fell from the saddle, catching himself against Thunder's flank. His legs felt like water. He tied Thunder to the hitching post with fumbling fingers and approached the front door. Each step required enormous effort, as if he were walking through deep mud. His vision swam. The porch steps seemed impossibly tall. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. He reached the door and raised his fist to knock, but before his knuckles could make contact, the world tilted violently. His knees buckled. The wooden porch rushed up to meet him. Jacob Morrison collapsed in a heap on the Henderson Ranch porch, unconscious from hunger, dehydration, and the weight of too many losses carried too far. He didn't hear the door open. He didn't see the woman who emerged, her face shifting from surprise to concern. He didn't feel her gentle hands checking his pulse, or hear her call out urgently for help. In his darkness, he dreamed of Sarah, of rain falling on green pastures, of a time when the world still made sense and tomorrow held promise instead of pain. Eleanor Henderson stood over the collapsed stranger on her porch, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. She was 58 years old, a widow herself for the past decade since her husband Robert had passed from heart attack. In that time, she'd learned to run the ranch alone, becoming one of the most respected ranchers in 3 counties. She'd also learned to read people, and this man sprawled unconscious at her feet told a story she knew all too well. His clothes were clean but threadbare, mended multiple times. His boots, once quality leather, were cracked and worn through at the heels. His hands bore the calluses of genuine ranch work, not the soft palms of a drifter or con man. The horse tied to her post was old but well cared for, its coat brushed despite everything else. But it was the man's face that struck her most, the deep lines of grief, the sunken cheeks of prolonged hunger, and something else. Even unconscious, there was dignity there, pride that hadn't quite been beaten out of him. "Miguel." "Rosa." Eleanor called out sharply. "I need help here." Her longtime ranch foreman, Miguel Alvarez, appeared first, rushing from a barn. He was followed by Rosa, the housekeeper who'd been with the Henderson family for 30 years. Both stopped short at the sight of the unconscious man. "Dios mío," Rosa breathed, already moving forward with practiced urgency. She'd raised 5 children and knew a medical emergency when she saw one. "How long has he been like this?" "Just collapsed. Let's get him inside." Eleanor was already kneeling, checking the man's pulse. It was weak, but steady. "Miguel, bring water." "Rosa, we need cool cloths and broth if we have any ready." Together, they managed to get Jacob inside and onto the sofa in the front parlor. His breathing was shallow, his skin hot and dry to the touch. As Rosa worked to cool him down with damp cloths, Eleanor went through his pockets, not to steal, but to find identification. She found a worn leather wallet containing a driver's license for Jacob Thomas Morrison, address listed as Morrison Ranch, 15 miles south. There's also a faded photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a bright smile, and a $20 bill, his last money, Eleanor suspected, saved for some emergency even worse than this. "Morrison Ranch," Eleanor said softly, recognition dawning. "I've heard of it. Small operation, been in the family for generations." She looked at Miguel. "Didn't we hear something about that ranch struggling?" Miguel nodded grimly. "Si, senora. The drought hit them hard. I heard the wife died a year or 2 ago. Medical bills." He looked at the unconscious man with sympathy. "He's probably lost everything." Rosa returned with warm broth. "He needs food, but slowly. His stomach won't be able to handle much at first." She began carefully spooning small amounts of liquid between Jacob's lips, waiting for the swallow reflex. Eleanor stood at the window, looking out at her prosperous ranch. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she stood in abundance, while men like this Morrison fellow were literally starving to death. The drought had hit everyone, but those with resources, like her late husband had wisely built up over the years, could weather the storm. Those without such cushions fell through the cracks. She remembered her own early struggles. Before marrying Robert, she'd been Eleanor May Thornton, daughter of a sharecropper who'd never owned a square foot of land in his life. She'd known hunger as a child, known the shame of wearing flour sack dresses to school, known what it felt like to be invisible to those with plenty. Robert Henderson had seen past all that when he'd met her at a church social. He'd courted her over her father's protests. "That Henderson boy is out of your league, girl. Don't get ideas above your station." But Robert had insisted, and they'd built a good life together. When he died, some people had expected her to sell the ranch and move away. Instead, she'd proven she could run it just as well as he had, maybe better. But she'd never forgotten where she came from, never forgotten what it felt like to be one bad season away from ruin. After about 20 minutes, Jacob's eyes began to flutter. He moaned softly, consciousness returning slowly. Rosa continued her patient work, getting more broth into him. Eleanor moved closer, pulling up a chair beside the sofa. Jacob's eyes opened fully, confusion and panic flashing across his face as he realized he was in a strange place. He tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. "Easy now," Eleanor said firmly but kindly. "You collapsed on my porch. You're safe." Jacob's eyes darted around the room, taking in the comfortable furnishings, the woman watching him, the Hispanic woman feeding him broth. Memory slowly returned. I came to ask about work," he managed, his voice cracking. "The roundup. I heard you might need. When did you last eat?" Eleanor interrupted, her tone brooking no nonsense. Jacob's jaw tightened. Pride warred with honesty on his weathered face. Finally, he looked away. 3 days ago. Maybe 4. I lose track." Rosa made a small sound of distress and immediately went to fetch more food. Eleanor studied the man before her, seeing the shame in his eyes, the way his hands gripped the blanket they'd covered him with as if he needed something to hold on to. "What happened to your ranch, Mr. Morrison? I know of your family's place." The question seemed to break something in Jacob. Maybe it was the gentleness in her voice, or maybe he was simply too weak to maintain his defenses any longer. The story came pouring out. The drought, the dying cattle, Sarah's illness and death, the mounting debts, the slow disintegration of everything he'd tried to build. He spoke of nights lying awake, trying to figure out which bill to pay and which to ignore, of selling off cattle one by one until only 7 remained, of the crushing loneliness of the empty house where Sarah's laughter used to ring. "I tried everything," he said, his voice breaking. "I took jobs in town when I could find them. I sold machinery, equipment, everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. He paused, swallowing hard. "I even sold Sarah's engagement ring. She would have understood, but it felt like selling my soul." Eleanor listened without interruption, her face impassive but her eyes soft with understanding. When he finally fell silent, exhausted from the effort of confession, she stood and walked to the window again. "The roundup position has been filled," she said finally, and Jacob's heart sank. "However, I have a different proposition for you." She turned back to face him, her expression serious. "I'm looking for an assistant ranch manager, someone who understands a work from the ground up, who knows what it means to struggle for every acre, every head of cattle, someone who won't waste resources or take success for granted." Jacob stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm in no position. The position comes with housing in the foreman's cottage. We have 2, and Miguel and his family live in one. It comes with meals, a fair salary, and benefits including health insurance after 90 days. I need someone I can trust, Mr. Morrison. Someone with integrity." "You don't know me," Jacob protested weakly. "How can you trust me?" Eleanor smiled then, a sad, knowing smile. "You came here with your last $20 in your pocket. I checked your wallet for identification. You could have spent that money on food days ago, but you saved it. Your horse is old and worn, but his coat is brushed, his hooves are trimmed. You care for what's yours even when you're starving. And when I asked you what happened, You told me the truth instead of making excuses or spinning lies to make yourself look better. She moved closer, looking him directly in the eyes. I've had a dozen ranch hands over the years who would steal equipment, lie about hours worked, cut corners that endangered the animals. I've had managers who looked perfect on paper, but couldn't be trusted to feed the cattle without supervision. You know what I never had? Someone who collapsed from hunger rather than steal food they needed. That's integrity, Mr. Morrison. That's character, and character can't be taught. Rosa returned with a tray containing soup, bread, and fresh fruit. She set it on the side table and began helping Jacob sit up enough to eat properly. He was still weak, but the broth had helped. His hands shook as he reached for the spoon. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "Probably not," Eleanor agreed with a slight smile. "But deserving and needing are two different things. You need this opportunity, and I need someone trustworthy. It's a business arrangement, not charity." But they both knew it was more than that. As Jacob slowly ate the first real meal he'd had in days, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks despite his best efforts to maintain composure, Eleanor made a decision. She'd been thinking about it even before he woke up, but now she was certain. "There's one more thing," she said. "Those 7 cattle you have left, bring them here. We'll integrate them into my herd, and when you're back on your feet, we'll work out a fair arrangement for you to build them back up. Partnership, not charity. You understand the difference." Jacob could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Good. Now eat. Rosa's cooking is the best in 3 counties, and you're going to need your strength. Work starts tomorrow, and I don't tolerate laziness." Her stern words were belied by the warmth in her eyes. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the Henderson Ranch house, Jacob Morrison ate his meal slowly, savoring every bite not just because his stomach needed the caution, but because each mouthful represented something he'd lost and was now finding again: hope. Outside, thunder nickered softly from the hitching post, sensing that something had changed, that the desperate journey had led them somewhere unexpected. Miguel went out to tend to the horse, giving him water and feed, brushing his coat, and checking his shoes with the same care he'd give his own animals. Eleanor watched from the window, a small smile playing at her lips. Her late husband Robert had always said that you could judge a person's character by how they treated animals and those who couldn't offer them anything in return. Jacob Morrison had passed that test without even knowing he was being evaluated. "You're doing a good thing," Rosa said quietly, coming to stand beside her employer. "But you know people will talk. They'll say you're foolish, trusting a desperate stranger." "Let them talk," Eleanor replied. "I've been running this ranch for 10 years by myself. I think I've earned the right to make my own decisions." She paused, then added more softly, "Besides, Robert always said that honesty deserved a full table. I think he'd approve." Rosa nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "He will be proud of you, Senora. Very proud." As evening approached and Jacob finished his meal, Eleanor laid out the practical details. He would rest tonight and regain his strength. Tomorrow, Miguel would drive him back to his ranch to collect his belongings and arrange for his remaining cattle to be transported. She'd advance him some salary to help settle his most urgent debts, not as a gift, but deducted from future wages at a fair interest rate. "One last thing," Eleanor said as she prepared to show him to the cottage where he'd be staying. "This arrangement only works if you're honest with me. Always. If you make a mistake, tell me. If you don't know how to do something, ask. If you disagree with the decision I make, speak up respectfully. I value truth over comfort. Can you promise me that?" Jacob met her gaze steadily, seeing in this strong woman something that reminded him of Sarah, not in appearance, but in that quality of absolute integrity that couldn't be faked or learned. "I promise, Mrs. Henderson, you won't regret this." "See that I don't, Mr. Morrison. Now come on. Rosa will have your cottage ready by now, and you need proper rest." As Jacob followed Eleanor out into the golden evening light, passing by the well-maintained barns and healthy cattle, walking toward a small but comfortable cottage that would be his new home, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: possibility. Not the naive optimism of his youth, but something harder won and more precious: The belief that tomorrow might be better than today, that effort might actually lead somewhere, that honest work and honest dealing might still matter in this world. Behind them, Rosa watched from the kitchen window, silently offering a prayer of thanks. She'd seen many ranch hands come and go over the years, but she had a feeling about this one. Sometimes she believed God put people in your path not by accident, but by design. The desperate man who'd collapsed on the porch and the strong woman who'd chosen to help him. Perhaps they were exactly what each other needed. The sun set over Henderson Ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And for the first time in years, Jacob Morrison went to sleep with a full stomach and something resembling peace in his heart. 3 months had passed since that September day, when Jacob Morrison collapsed on Eleanor Henderson's porch, and the Texas prairie had transformed from scorched gold to winter brown. The first frost had come and gone, and the ranch had settled into the rhythm of winter work, maintaining equipment, mending fences, preparing for spring calving season. Jacob stood in the east pasture, his breath fogging in the cold morning air, watching the cattle graze on the winter wheat Eleanor had planted. Among them were his 7 original cattle, now healthy and thriving, integrated seamlessly into the Henderson herd. Bessie, Sarah's favorite Hereford, had even calved successfully, a strong bull calf that showed promise. The transformation in Jacob himself was almost as dramatic as the season change. He'd gained back weight, the gauntness gone from his face. The deep lines of despair had softened, though the marks of grief and struggle remained. He'd never be the carefree young man he'd been before loss taught him its harsh lessons. But he was functional again, purposeful, alive in ways that mattered. More importantly, he'd found something at Henderson Ranch that he'd lost at his own, a sense of competence and control. Eleanor was a demanding boss, but a fair one. She expected excellence, but provided the resources and support necessary to achieve it. She listened to his suggestions. His years of experience were valued here, not dismissed. And she kept her word about everything, from salary to respect to the partnership arrangement regarding his cattle. The cottage he lived in was small but comfortable, warm in winter and cool in summer. Rosa had made sure it was stocked with everything he needed, and Miguel's family, his wife Maria, and their 3 teenage children, had welcomed him into their extended circle with easy warmth. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jacob ate meals with other people, heard laughter, felt part of something larger than his own grief. But not everything was resolved. The debts from his old ranch still loomed, though Eleanor had helped him negotiate payment plans with his creditors. The ranch itself sat empty, slowly deteriorating, still technically his but unsellable in its current condition and still carrying the burden of property taxes and a mortgage. It was a wound that wouldn't quite heal, a reminder of failure that refused to fade. On this particular December morning, as Jacob checked the cattle and made notes on his clipboard about which heifers were showing signs of early pregnancy, he heard the sound of a truck approaching. He looked up to see Eleanor's red pickup bouncing across the pasture, pulling up beside him. She rolled down the window, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Morning, Jacob. Got a minute?" "Of course." He walked over to the truck, curious. Eleanor usually communicated through Miguel during the workday, unless something important had come up. "Get in. There's something I want to show you." Intrigued, Jacob climbed into the passenger seat. Eleanor drove in silence for a few minutes, heading not toward the ranch buildings but toward the southern boundary of her property. Finally, she spoke. "You've been here 3 months now. I've been watching you work, watching how you interact with the crew, how you handle problems. Miguel speaks highly of you, says you're the best assistant he's had." "Miguel's a good teacher," Jacob replied carefully, unsure where this was going. "He also says you have nightmares, that you wake up sometimes calling out for Sarah." Jacob flushed with embarrassment. The cottage walls were apparently thinner than he'd thought. "I'm sorry if I've been disturbing." "Don't apologize. Grief doesn't have a timeline, and it doesn't disappear just because you're in a new place." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "But I've been thinking about your situation, and I have a proposition." She pulled the truck to a stop at the southern fence line. Beyond it lay a stretch of land that had once been part of Henderson Ranch but had been sold off decades ago. It had changed hands several times since then and was currently listed for sale. 200 acres of good grazing land with a small house and barn, both in need of repair. The Corrigan place, Jacob said, recognizing it. Didn't old Tom Corrigan die last year? He did. His children live back east and just want to sell. They've had on the market for 8 months with no takers. The economy's tough, and most folks don't have the capital for land purchases right now, even cheap land. It's good land, though, Jacob observed, his rancher's eye automatically assessing the property. Needs work, but the bones are solid. Creek runs through it, so water's not an issue. Soil looks decent. It is good land, Eleanor agreed. And I want to buy it. Jacob looked at her in surprise. To expand your operation? No. She turned to face him fully. To sell to you. The words hung in the cold air between them. Jacob's mind struggled to process what he'd just heard. Mrs. Henderson, I can't afford. Hear me out, she interrupted. Here's what I'm proposing. I'll buy the land now while the price is low. The Corrigans are motivated sellers, and I have the cash. You continue working here as assistant manager, but in your spare time, you fix up that property. I'll provide materials at cost, and Miguel's boys have been wanting to learn construction. They can help you in exchange for teaching them ranch management. She pulled out a folder from behind the seat, handing it to him. I worked out the numbers with my accountant. You'd buy the land from me on a 20-year mortgage at 4% interest, well below market rate. The payments would be about the same as renting decent land, maybe even less. Your salary here would easily cover it plus your living expenses. And here's the key part. You'd run your own cattle operation on that land while still working here. Build your herd back up slowly, the right way. Jacob opened the folder with shaking hands, scanning the papers inside. Purchase agreements, mortgage terms, budget projections. It was all there, professionally prepared, thought through in detail. Why would you do this? He asked, his voice hoarse. This is too much. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, staring out at the Corrigan land. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old memories. I told you I value integrity, Jacob. Let me tell you why that matters so much to me. When my husband Robert died, I discovered that our accountant had been embezzling from us for years. Thousands of dollars gone. Robert had trusted him completely. They'd been friends since childhood. That betrayal, on top of losing my husband, nearly broke me. She turned back to Jacob, her eyes intense. I sued, of course, and won. Got most of the money back eventually. But the lesson stayed with me. Trust is rare, Jacob. Real integrity is even rarer. In 3 months, you've proven yourself in ways that matter. You've never lied to me, never tried to take advantage, never cut corners even when you thought I wasn't looking. You care about the animals, you respect the crew, and you work like every day matters. I'm just doing my job, Jacob protested. Exactly, and that's more than many people can say. Eleanor tapped the folder in his hands. This isn't charity, Jacob. This is an investment. I'm investing in character, in someone I trust to be a good neighbor and steward of the land. And selfishly, I'm getting a reliable employee who'll have a vested interest in staying in the area and maintaining a good relationship with me. It's good business. Jacob looked down at the papers, then out at the land beyond the fence. His mind reeled with possibilities and fears. Could he really do this? Could he risk trying again after failing so completely before? What about my old ranch? He asked quietly. I still owe on it, and it's falling apart. That's the other part of my proposal, Eleanor said. Let it go. I know that hurts. It's your family land, your grandfather's legacy. But, Jacob, it's also an anchor around your neck. The mortgage is underwater. The property needs massive investment to be functional again, and every month you're throwing money away on taxes and interest for a place you can't use. She leaned forward, her voice urgent. Let the bank foreclose. Yes, it'll hurt your credit for a few years, but you're not going to need credit. You'll have this mortgage with me, and I don't care about credit scores. I care about character. Let go of the past and build a future instead. The words struck deep. Let go. How many nights had he lain awake, tormented by the idea of losing his grandfather's ranch? How many times had he felt like a failure, betraying the Morrison legacy by letting the land slip away? But sitting here now, looking at Eleanor's kind, shrewd face and the new land spread out before him, Jacob had a realization. His grandfather had built that ranch with honest work and integrity. Those were the real legacy, not the dirt and wood. Those values hadn't died with the ranch. They'd carried Jacob through his darkest times and brought him here, to this moment, to this possibility. "I need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course. Take your time." Eleanor started the truck. "But Jacob, don't take too long. The Corrigans won't wait forever, and neither will good opportunities." As they drove back to the main ranch buildings, Jacob's mind churned with thoughts and calculations. Could he really start over? Could he build something new from the ashes of his failure? The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. That evening, after work was done and supper eaten, Jacob walked down to the south pasture alone. The sun was setting, painting the winter sky in shades of pink and gold that Sarah would have loved. He stood at the fence, looking at the Corrigan place, and for the first time in years, he let himself imagine a future. He could see it, the little house fixed up and painted, maybe white with blue trim like Sarah had always wanted. The barn repaired and filled with equipment. Cattle grazing on green pasture. Maybe even someday, if he was very lucky and very careful, a woman who'd smile at him across the breakfast table and make the empty spaces feel full again. "What should I do, Sarah?" he whispered to the evening air. "I'm scared to try again. Scared to fail again." The wind rustled through the dry winter grass, and in his heart, he imagined Sarah's response. Not her voice, exactly, but the essence of who she'd been. She'd never been afraid of taking chances. She'd married him, hadn't she, when he was just a struggling young rancher with more dreams than sense. She believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Sarah would tell him to take the risk, to choose possibility over safety, to honor the past, not by clinging to dead dreams, but by building new ones. Jacob stood at that fence line for a long time as darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast Texas sky. When he finally walked back to his cottage, his decision was made. The next morning, he found Eleanor in her office, going over feed orders with Miguel. When she looked up and saw his face, she knew the answer before he spoke. "I want to do it," Jacob said. "I want to accept your offer." Eleanor smiled, a rare broad smile that transformed her usually serious face. "Good. I'll call the Corrigans today. We can close within a month if everything goes smoothly." Miguel clapped Jacob on the shoulder, grinning. "My boys will be excited. They've been hoping you'd say yes. Carlos especially. He wants to learn everything about ranch management." As the details are discussed and plans made, Jacob felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd been carrying, the burden of past failures and lost hopes, didn't disappear. Grief and regret don't vanish on command. But they became lighter, more bearable, integrated into a larger story that was still being written. 6 months later, as spring painted the prairie green and wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion after good winter rains, Jacob Morrison stood on the porch of his newly repaired house on what was now legally Morrison Ranch. Second generation, you might say. The property had been transformed through months of hard work. The house gleamed with fresh paint. The barn stood sturdy with a new roof, and new fencing marked clean boundaries. In the pastures, his herd had grown to 15 head, including 3 new calves born that spring. Eleanor's truck pulled up the drive, and she emerged with a basket of Rose's fresh tamales, a housewarming gift for the official move-in day. Miguel and his family weren't far behind, bringing furniture and household goods donated from various sources. "It looks good, Jacob," Eleanor said, surveying the property with satisfaction. "Really good. Your grandfather would be proud." Jacob thought about that for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "Maybe, but I think Sarah would be prouder. She always said it's not about where you fall down, but whether you get back up." Wise woman. The best. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out at the land. The partnership between them had proven successful beyond either's initial expectations. Jacob continued working as assistant manager at Henderson Ranch while building his own operation, and the arrangement benefited both. Eleanor had the reliable help she needed, and Jacob had the security and resources to rebuild properly, without the desperate shortcuts that lead to failure. But more than the practical success, Something deeper had been restored, a sense of community, of mutual respect, of the old values that sometimes get lost in modern life. In a world that often rewarded flash over substance and shortcuts over integrity, Eleanor Henderson's decision to honor honesty with opportunity had created ripples extending far beyond one man's second chance. Word had spread through the county about the arrangement. Other ranchers, inspired by Eleanor's example, had started looking at their struggling neighbors differently, offering hands up instead of judgment. Miguel's oldest son, Carlos, had indeed learned ranch management and was already being courted by other operations. Rosa had started a small catering business on the side, her reputation for excellent cooking bringing in steady income for her family. As the sun set on that spring evening, casting golden light across green pastures dotted with healthy cattle, a small gathering formed on Jacob's new porch. Eleanor, Miguel, and Maria, Rosa, and her husband, Carlos, and his siblings, a few neighboring ranchers who'd stopped by to welcome Jacob properly to his new place. Someone brought out a guitar, and music filled the evening air, old songs in English and Spanish, mixing together like the people who sang them. Jacob stood slightly apart from the group for a moment, taking in the scene. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the losses and failures, the hunger and despair, the moment of collapse that had become a turning point, and the woman who'd chosen to honor honesty instead of taking advantage of desperation. "You gonna stand there all night? Or you gonna join us?" Eleanor called out, her eyes twinkling. Jacob smiled, a real smile, the first in years that reached all the way to his eyes, and joined the celebration. In his pocket, he carried 2 photographs now. One was the original picture of Sarah, worn and precious, a reminder of love and loss and lessons learned the hard way. The other was newer, a photo from closing day at the courthouse, showing Eleanor and Jacob shaking hands, both of them looking serious but satisfied, sealing a deal based on trust instead of just contracts. Sarah's photo reminded him where he'd been and what he'd survived. Eleanor's reminded him that integrity still mattered, that character still counted, that in a world often harsh and unforgiving, sometimes, if you were very lucky, honesty really did deserve a full table. As stars emerged in the darkening sky,